David, we've seen Paul and we've followed him through his missionary journey activities in Asia Minor, and last encountered him in Ephesus and heard him get through some trials and tribulations there. And we heard him give his final address to the leaders of the church, the elders of Ephesus at a place called Miletus on the western coast of Asia Minor. And now, in the next couple of chapters, we see him in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And there are some interesting little details here. When he gets to the Levant, he comes to Caesarea, and he encounters some prophets. The daughters of Philip the evangelist and a guy named Agabus in chapter 21, 9 and 10. What do you make of this business of prophecy in Acts?
Well, I think it's easy for us to, coming from our church school backgrounds or catechetical backgrounds, to think of prophecy as being an Old Testament phenomenon where you do thus says the Lord. But it's clear that prophecy was alive and well in New Testament times, and that there were Christian prophets, and sometimes by the Holy Spirit and some by false spirits, would call out what they thought to be truths, some of them descriptive and some of them predicting what was yet going to happen. And I think this is a place where we still see that ongoing debate where you test the spirits. Is the Spirit of God speaking, or false prophets speaking through false spirits? And we have two examples of what look to them like complicated prophecy, though Agabus says what turns out to be true in lots of ways, which is we've seen already with the business about who Paul and Barnabas were, that they were representatives of the Most High, even though she said it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, sometimes these prophets do prophesy and talk about the future.
Right.
Sometimes they just speak their mind.
Yes, right. And the trick is to figure out which is which.
Yeah.
I think both in Acts and for early Christians.
Right. Okay, so Paul goes to Jerusalem, and but why in Acts does he come to Jerusalem?
Yeah, well, it's a little tricky because here he comes to visit James, and my sense by the time you're through is that at least in the first verses of this conversation, he and James kind of go over Acts 15 again and talk about what Gentiles do and do not have to do, and we've already had that established. What's one of the places where Acts seems different to us from the Paul's letters is it's very clear in most of his letters that he intends to go to Jerusalem from the Gentiles bearing an offering, that a very important part of his sense of who he is as an apostle to the Gentiles is that he brings this offering, which is to be some kind of sign of the unity of Jews and Gentiles in the faith. And my strong suspicion is that what we have here in this trip to James is a kind of suppressed memory or suppressed account of the trip, which must have been the trip bearing this offering that just simply never mentioned, but which really dominates a great deal of Paul's own talk about why he's undertaking his mission altogether.
Right, we have those two chapters of 2 Corinthians.
Two chapters of 2 Corinthians dedicated to it entirely, references to it in
Galatians, and at the end of Romans, it's clear that he's going to Jerusalem.
Go to Jerusalem, bring the offering.
Bring the offering.
So what's happened? Is it become unimportant at the end of the first century? Is it the case that the Jews rejected this, that James and Peter, or whoever was there, James and John, rejected the offering? And if that's the case, does that kind of do in Luke's idea of the blessed unity of the church we've seen in chapter 15? So you suppress that and talk about a visit that doesn't face up to this awful fact that just at the time where you're stressing the unity of a church that includes Jews and Gentiles, the Gentiles send their offering and the Jews turn it down.
Yeah, we don't know how Paul's visit turned out.
We have no idea.
Except for the fact that he got himself in some sort of trouble.
Exactly. We have no idea.
Right. The story that Luke tells is that Paul visits James in Jerusalem. This is in chapter 21 of Acts, and they have this conversation that you mentioned that involves discussion of circumcision. Yeah. And then James suggests something to Paul, that he undertake a vow. Can you say something about that?
He suggests that Paul essentially undertake the vow that these two men are going to undertake in order to go into the temple, which is a kind of what we call a kind of Nazirite vow, that they're going to shave their heads and join in general kind of abstemiousness for the days to come. And Paul, kind of contrary to the Paul we'd expect from Galatians, says, all right, I'll take that on and I'll fulfill the vow. I suppose to show to James that he's still a loyal Jew, even though he is an apostle to the Gentiles. He has not given up his own Jewish commitments in order to be an apostle to the Gentiles, which is different than saying Gentiles have to take on these same commitments to be part of the church.
Do you think that's historically accurate, or is Luke reading something into
I puzzle about that. What do you think? It sounds, Paul's almost too accommodating here.
Yeah. Of course, he does tell us in 1 Corinthians
All things
9
to all
that he's a
people.
Jew to the Jews.
Yeah, he does.
And so I don't think it's impossible that he might have done something like
I
this.
agree, it's not impossible. My Paul is so feisty and reformed that, you know.
Yeah. Having tangled with James and the people from James in the past, maybe he was trying to be accommodating.
Could well be that that's easier to right, exactly.
In any case, can you say a little bit more about James and what we know of him?
Well, James comes up in the non-Christian literature also of the time as being a leader of the Jerusalem church. He's clearly understood as being Jesus' own brother. And in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul lists the people to whom the risen Lord appeared, James, the brother of Jesus, is one of them. If there's any continuity between what we read in the Gospels and what we read in 1 Corinthians 15, then James, who was not much of a believer during Jesus' Galilean ministry, post-resurrection becomes not only a leader but an apostle. A very important figure in the life of the church. I wish we knew more about him.
We know he was martyred, too.
We know he was martyred. I doubt very much that the Epistle of James was really written by him, though I think it was attributed to him. And he clearly represents a kind of continuity with the Jewish side of the Jesus tradition, and that makes sense, that the elder brother, the eldest next brother, would take over something of the authority of the martyred brother, though the brothers both martyred and resurrected in this case.
In any case, Paul has this meeting with James, and he goes into the temple, despite the fact that he seems to be observing Jewish traditional custom. He causes a stir.
Dragged out, accused,
And he offers a little defense of himself here, right, before the council. And this is one of the important defense speeches of Paul.
And part of what he tries to do once again, I think, is to show how, here maybe as much as in taking the vow, shows how much he stands within the Jewish tradition, and learn from Gamaliel, who was a rabbi who appears elsewhere in this story, and then recounts now, Luke has recounted, now Paul recounts the story of this Damascus road trip, the Damascus road journey and vision, with a little shift. There's now not just the emphasis on the conversion, but as he talks about going to the temple afterwards, as a strong stress on his being called to be the apostle to the Gentiles, or to be the missionary to the Gentiles. And in this case, in this sense, in some ways, Acts 22 sounds more like Paul's self-designation in Galatians than all the stuff about why are you persecuting me that we get in Acts 9.
What do we know about Gamaliel? Do we know anything about?
We know that he was one of the more open-minded Pharisaic rabbis.
We encountered him.
And we encountered him as a sympathetic hearer of the gospel back in the first 3 or 4 chapters. So he's been signaled already.
Right. So this is one of those gestures that Luke makes to say that, good right-minded folk in the Jewish tradition recognize
this is we're part of a long tradition here, right?
Yeah,
This
we're
is,
connected
I'm
to
not
that.
just inventing this, exactly.
Right.
I'm adding on what I've received. This is not out of left field or the unforeseen future.
Yeah. One little episode after this speech to the of defense and his account of his conversion and all of that is the encounter with a Roman tribune. And we have again the issue of Paul's Roman citizenship.
Yeah. Once again, I think the strong stress that because he's a citizen, he needs to be treated differently than if he were simply an interloper, a non-citizen dragged in. And what we pointed to before briefly, that kind of interesting contrast where the tribune actually ends up a little bit jealous. And I worked very, very hard for my citizenship, and it's just been handed to you. And that seems unfair, but at that point, the tribune does what he's supposed to do and no longer seeks to punish Paul.
Right, and this is important for the developing plot of Acts too, isn't it? Because it's because Paul is a Roman citizen.
That he has to go to Rome.
Has to go to Rome, So this is sowing the seed, as Luke has done so often in the past.
Luke is terrific at signaling what he's going to do in 2 or 3 chapters, time after time after time. Richard Purvo, in the commentary on Acts that I read through to get ready for this and that you edited, says that essentially from after chapter 20 on, from the Miletus speech on, there's an echo of the Passion story here, that you have increasing, brought before both Jewish and Gentile authorities, kind of increasing pressure, increasing haste, and increasing danger. I think there's some wisdom to that.
Okay, we have Paul again defending himself before the council and making an interesting little defensive move here in chapter 23, right, when he sees the council is composed of different kinds of factions.
Yeah.
What do you make of all of that?
He chooses his team. That is, he says, I see that while there are many Democrats and Republicans among you, I myself am, and fill in the blank, and hopes to get 51 votes on his side by appealing to his party. But in fact, lots of evidence, both here and in his own writings, that he is a Pharisee, and the places where this is important here are twofold. One, that Pharisees did believe in the resurrection of the dead, and so he will claim in Acts from time to time, and maybe hint in the epistles, that as one who believes in Jesus' resurrection, he's part of a great continuity. The fact that Jesus is raised, that's news. The fact that the dead will not be raised, that's not news. That's the tradition in which he's lived. And also the willingness beyond the written word of the Pentateuch to accept the idea that God gives ongoing visions and dreams, and that explains why he can be obedient to a vision here. And Pharisees say, yes, we believe that too.
As opposed to the Sadducees who
Well,
said
Sadducees, no, only the Pentateuch,
Torah.
only what's in Torah, only what's written. No new doctrines, no new visions, no new dreams. And in a way, Paul puts a bet on having enough votes from his party to get out of it.
And this connects with the appeal to Gamaliel back there at the beginning of chapter 22.
Another Pharisee, absolutely.
So it's very much on Luke's mind here to show that continuity and to show an affinity between the Pharisees, who at this point were becoming the dominant element. Or their successors, the rabbis, becoming the dominant element.
No, exactly. Which again gets back to what we'll look at next time, which is where are the Jews at the end of this story for Acts.
Okay, so we have those seeds sown of ambiguity that we're going to
I think
worry about a little bit more.
Yeah.
But we also have a plot to kill Paul.
We do.
All right, in chapter 23.
So once again, I mean, and maybe it's a little bit of that. It's not exactly the good Jew, bad Jew distinction, but there clearly are rabble-rousers within the Jewish people, and there are enemies within the Jewish leadership, and that's not everybody, but it's consistent, and they're out to get him once again, and he needs to be protected.
Yeah, things heat up in these latter chapters.
Things heat up hugely, yeah.
Right, from that episode a little bit ago where Paul says, his blood be on your
Blood be
hands.
on. Then from there on,
Right.
it looks like that at lots of points. Yeah.
And finally, then, Paul is hauled off to the Roman governor, Felix. What do we know about him?
We know that he had been a freedman, that he had himself been a slave. He married into the Herodian family, I think, so which may have been true love or a really smart political move to get himself some creds in Palestine, but nonetheless becomes part of the leadership that had ties both on the Gentile and on the Jewish side. And I think had a not very good reputation as a governor, not only for Jews, but for people in general.
No, I don't think he's on the hit list.
I think he's not on anybody's hit list of most, most amiable
This is another
governors.
one of those points where some people try to draw a correlation between the narrative of Acts and an external chronology, trying to figure out exactly when Felix and Festus changed office, although that's very difficult.
And it comes late 50s
or early 60s.
Yeah,
We can't pin it down with precision, otherwise
Yeah.
we'd have a better idea.
Yeah, and it's
when Paul
one of
was in
those
prison.
nice places where we know that Luke is paying attention to that history, whether he's reflecting it accurately or not. That matters to him. I mean, God and Felix and Festus are part of the same story, not just God and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Joseph and Mary.
So at this point, Paul has made an apology. He's in Roman hands, but there's still more to come.
He's on his way.